Welcome to Introduction to MX, webinar number 5. We'll be discussing some of the production control management and electronic work instruction sections and covering new topics, new designs, and hopefully get everybody excited for the new features that we have coming. Today we're going to begin with the manufacturing operations management section, focusing or targeting the production control management module. And throughout the session today, we're going to cover the work center scheduling and work order status, production control, prior work center preview, work center history, inspection and defect data collection, and the electronic work instructions. Just like all the others, after each section, we'll answer any questions that you have for the section. So please ask your questions. And if you don't think of them until later, don't worry about it. We'll answer any questions at the end as well. First area we're going to talk about is the work center scheduling and work order status. And this area has received some of the biggest changes and upgrades of anything so far. When considering and reviewing for this new design, we decided to convert from a work order-based approach to a work center-based approach. The production supervisors and managers, they want to know the work order status, but most of the users are the workers, and they just want their critical information. They want to know what's in my work center now and what's the priority. When's it due? How do I build the job? Where does it need to go when I'm done? If you don't have all the parts, why don't I have all the parts and when will they arrive? And which parts are on the machine right now? So using those critical questions, we designed an entirely new approach. This screen is adjusted or converted from a work order-based approach to a work center-based approach. You might track work orders, but you work in work centers. So the screen will open to the default work center for the user, but the user has the ability to change to additional work centers if desired. And within the work center, they get a list of the jobs. And because the screen automatically refreshes, it means you can put it up on a terminal somewhere or put it up on a big screen. I've seen people do that. And it provides a real-time status update of every job in the selected work center. So you know what's going on at any given time. Some of the new features, it has automatic prioritization. Now, these priorities are based on the setup and run times, the processing time required, when the job is due, how many boards are left to build or assemblies are left to build, things like that. And those priorities are automatically calculated and arranged. The production supervisor or manager has the ability to drag and drop. So if they felt like that needed to be moved up, they can change the order around. The priorities are automatically adjusted, and now that work center has the current marching orders. It also has visibility of the ITAR status for that job and the DPAS information. Each one of these can be assigned to a worker or a line and indicated if it's in process or not. So you know which jobs are actively working on, which are in the queue. You can also quickly see the material status. Click of a button, you can see all of the parts that are needed for that work center with the status by part of that part. So if the part has enough on hand and in the work order and in the work center to meet that demand, it's white, telling you it's good. If it's partially short, it will be yellow, indicating there are some parts, but it's insufficient to build the entire quantity. If it's completely short, meaning it's needed, but it's not there, it'll be red. And then if you add a line shortage, it's blue. So this is a different approach for production workers to be able to record shortages, like if they've damaged a part, if they've lost a part for whatever reason, they can request that those shortages be filled directly from production control. They don't have to go into kitting like they used to. From production, they can fill out the information, record why they need more parts, how many they need, and now material management has all of that relevant information. Additionally, for those of you that do cable wire harness manufacturing, you can also see the cut sheet information for the parts for the given work center, allowing you to communicate that information so they can go ahead and prep all of those components. Another section of this is quick access to the electronic work instructions. We'll go into that in more detail in a different section, but this is where they'll access all of the relevant production information and pull up the drawings and documents that they need. Do you have any questions related to the new shop floor tracking screen? Next, we're going to jump into how you do the transactions, but before we get into that detail, do you have any questions related to that? Then we will go ahead and move on. The next section we're going to cover is production control, and also touch upon material transfer by specific ID, serial number, lot code, date code information. So on the previous screen, we talked about how production workers can know what's important, but the next logical question is, how do you actually do the work? How do you indicate the material that was used? In previous webinars, we discussed the new approach for kitting and issuing. MX completely changed the kitting process. So instead of kitting to the job, you're reserving parts for more accurate inventory control. And this section will help you understand why. From within the production control management, once you have your list of jobs, you can drill in to see the details about any specific job. In the top left corner, we have the list of active parts. Now, when I talk about active parts, I'm essentially talking about any reels or packages or whatever that are currently on the machines right now. When pulling for a job, inventory might put in the kit 5, 6, 7, whatever's needed packages of a given part number, so that they know which reels or packages were used for production, but they don't necessarily know which are being actively used right now. And it doesn't even have to be a machine. This could be hand placing parts. It could be any way that these components are going to be consumed in the production process. Now, the easiest thing to think about is the reels that are put onto the machines, but it's not limited to that. To put a part on a machine or to make it active, you'll take one of the reels that was received, the specific ID was already printed, the barcode was already printed on the label, and simply scan it in production. It's automatically added to the job, and it can do some validation if it's in the wrong work center or it's not approved manufacturer. It can alert the user of that so you're not using the wrong parts. It knows the work center where it's assigned to be used, how many are still on that package right now. So this particular reel has 128 pieces, and I can see that it uses 10 per assembly as I transfer it out of the work center. As I do the transactions, each assembly that leaves my work center will reduce the package quantity by the quantity per unit so that I have an accurate measurement of what remains on the reel so I can see when it's going to run out of parts. You're assigning the specific ID to the specific serial number so you know exactly which parts were used on which assembly. So your lot tracking, your date code tracking, all of that is automated just by transferring the product after you define the parts that are active. Now, let's say I'm not really paying attention and I grab another part that's the same part and I try to put it on the same kit. When I scan it, the system alerts me that there's already an active reel. It hasn't run out yet, and it gives me an opportunity to correct it. I have 3 choices. The first choice is to use both. This is for the situation where the part really did run out, but the board is mid-process, and so I need to replace the reel in production. And some of the locations were using the old specific ID. Some of the locations are using the new specific ID. By using both, I account for that, and both specific IDs are associated with it. The next option is to return it. Right now, it shows that this specific ID has 128 pieces left over. Maybe I needed it for something else because I want that manufacturer for a different job. maybe it's not enough to finish the job, so I'm going to go ahead and pull it from a different reel, or whatever reason. I'm telling the system, take whatever's left, send it back to inventory, make it available for something else, and use this job or use this specific ID in its place. The last option is to replace. That's to account for attrition and things like that that we don't know about because this isn't directly communicating with the machine. So it shows I have 10 left, but because of attrition, I've actually used them all up. And when I scan the new reel, because I'm replacing the reel, so I'm going to scan the new one on there, I tell it, go ahead and replace it. And those extra 10 pieces are counted as excess parts that are consumed in this job. So I know my attrition level for this job. And we can do all of this without directly communicating with the machines. Now, we are having conversations with different manufacturers about having the direct communication. But if those manufacturers, those other providers don't communicate with the machines, or you're not using a machine, or you don't have those other providers at all, this allows you to get detailed, accurate tracking from the specific ID to the assembly serial number without a lot of overhead. And in fact, it's easier than the old method. I'm going to first come in, scan all the parts that I'm putting on the machine or that I've set up in my assembly line to say, this is where I'm pulling the parts. And then to do the transfer, I have the option of either doing a batch mode. So in this case, I can see all of the serial numbers that are currently in my work center, and I can scan the first serial number and scan the last serial number. If they're in range, it automatically selects them. These 7 boards will be transferred. It will deduct 7 assemblies worth of parts from each of these specific IDs and then transfer to the next work center. I also have the ability to just select everything in the work center because maybe I always do everything all at once, and so I don't want to worry about scanning it, just give me everything that's in the work center. Or I could go into single mode, and in that situation, I just scan the serial number and it will transfer the product. But let's say I scan a serial number that isn't in the work center. I don't have the list, so I can't see it because I'm in single mode. When I do the scan, the system tells me that serial number should be in pick and place topside. I need to go put it back. No transaction occurs. It's enforcing the routing. Now, if I don't have a serialized assembly, obviously I'm not going to select any serial numbers. I can just enter the quantity that I'm transferring. It does the same thing with assigning the specific ID. In this case, it's not connecting it to the assembly serial number because one doesn't exist, but it is reducing the on-hand quantity by the appropriate assembly amounts. As it works today, by default, it's going to transfer to the next work center. And if the user has permission, they can pick a different work center in the routing. But a new feature that I'll talk about a little bit more in a different section today, optional work centers. Now, what is an optional work center? An optional work center is something that's not part of the normal routing, but you have the ability to transfer to as needed without having special permissions. Now, because we have given you the ability to work in your specific work center and see the priorities for the work center and transfer for your work center, it doesn't remove the possibility of needing to see the job overall. So the last section that we've added is the ability to see the full routing for the work order with the status, just like it was before. You can see the current on-hand quantity for each work center in process. That way, if you need to kind of get an overall picture of the flow, you can see that. And you can see which work centers are internal and which are outsourced. Now, what if you don't have specific ID set up, or you are in transition of doing it, or the part doesn't really lend itself to doing specific ID tracking because it's a bulk part, or you just don't want to use it. You just really like the old method of issuing parts to the kit. Fortunately, we've set up a system to do that using manual part issue. So I'm going to go ahead and jump over there really quick. With manual part issue, you have the ability to indicate the work order that you want to issue to, see a list of the parts. When you select the part, you can see the on-hand manufacturers with location information and the specific IDs, or you can just scan the specific ID to find it. Maybe you have a specific ID, but you just don't want to do the auto issue, or there was a mistake and you need to clean it up. You can come in here to manually issue parts to the kit or correct any mistakes from the issuing process. So this still provides the ability to do the manual process that existed before, but we anticipate most people will want to use the auto issue. Now, at the end of the process, and by the end of the process, I don't mean the end of the job, I mean the end of the work center. So as a Wave employee, I've completed this job completely through the process, I'm done with it, and any parts that I place in this process can now be sent back to inventory. I can close out this step. From part reconciliation, I have the ability to come in and see the parts that should be remaining and decide whether they get scrapped or sent back to inventory. And I can reconcile that entire work center, which closes that work center while the rest of the work order remains open, so that those parts are available for other jobs and you have an accurate update of where everything stands. And then, as I mentioned, you can come in here to do corrections if you need to. You can go into the issue adjustment history and click on any of the details, view the issued information, make corrections and adjustments as required. So, do you have any questions related to the transfer shop floor tracking process? Doesn't look like it. Let's move on to the next section. We're going to discuss the prior work center preview. With all the relevant information for the current work center and the jobs within the work center, the next most relevant information is what's coming to the job or coming to your work center. The prior work center shows all of the jobs in any work center in any routing where your work center is the next work center. So you don't have to know which jobs are in production. You don't have to know the routings for those jobs. You don't have to monitor a bunch of prior work centers. Now, sometimes it's really obvious and it's not a big deal to monitor that. But depending on your processes, the number of steps and the number of jobs, you may not know which work centers or which work orders are coming into your work center next. With the prior work center, even though it's view only, you can see every job from every work center where your work center is next. You can see when it's due, ITAR information, all of the relevant work order information, whether they've started work on it, and which work center it's coming from. This allows you to, the work center or production supervisor, to monitor and plan for future jobs and get things prepared for things that are coming soon. Any questions related to prior work center? I have a question. Is there any password input needed to transfer jobs? So with MX, we have modified the password approach because of the easy on and the flexibility in distribution through different devices. It's set up so that users will log in, do their transactions, and log off. So the password happens when you log in, and it takes the current active user. Their information is used in that transaction. It doesn't look like we have any additional questions related to that. So let's go ahead and move to the next section. Now we'll discuss the work center history. In the work center history, I can scan or enter my work order number and see all of the transactions that have happened for that work order in the work center. So I can see when the quantities, the dates, the timestamps, the initials, who moved it, and know that went from my work center to this other work center. So I know exactly what's happened. I can also search by part number and part number range. I'll go back a ways just so I have data. And I can see all of the transactions that have happened against a given assembly across all work orders and get my whole transfer history. I can also do that for just a given date range if I want to see what's happened in that time frame. And this is also a view only. You can't do any transactions in here. It's just to access the information that you've been collecting. So if you need to audit it, you can get the information that you need. Do you have any questions related to the history? Doesn't look like it. Let's jump into the next section. Next, we'll go into inspection and defect data collection. Now, this one, I'll show you the screens that are there. They are adding to this functionality to add more defect collection information, but I'll explain what's there and what they have coming. So in this one, you'll again have your work order or your work center selected. You pick the work order that you're working on, and when you're doing the inspection, you can do inline mode like this, where you scan the serial number, indicate pass or failed, document the defects that you find, and you have the history down below, so you can see all the defects that have been found against the specific serial numbers, and disposition those as needed. If it's a serialized assembly, you can see the history against that as well. You can also do batch mode like it was before, where you will see I'm inspecting 1,000 boards, or the batch is 1,000 boards, I'm inspecting 50 of them, and there were no failures or one failure or whatever, and document all of that information. The history is similar to that. You can look at a specific serial number or assembly number and see all of the defects that have happened against that. And so you know exactly what work is done. So if you get an RMA back and the assembly is serialized, you can scan it and see exactly what was found through the original production, so you can maybe go back to some of those fixes and see if they actually happen. We don't have a rework and repair section yet. This is where you will document the fixes that have been made against those serial numbers so that you have that full history and traceability. Any questions related to defect entry and repair? If not, we'll zoom back out a little bit to manufacturing operations management, but this time go into the electronic work instructions, or EWI. We'll go ahead and start with the setup, and then we'll move into how to interact with it. All right, so under Manufacturing Operations Management, Electronic Work Instructions, this is where you will access all of the setup, or you'll set up all of the setup information for any given assembly. So let me go ahead and pick an assembly so we can look at the setup details. Let's do this part number. High level, see the assembly description, customer, whether it's serialized, if it's an active part, ITAR controlled, things like that. And I can drill into it for more information. And this is a significant change. This is my routing setup. One of the first things you may notice about this is I have multiple routings on the left side. So we're introducing routing templates and multiple routes per assembly for standard production, and multiple routes per assembly for rework. So let's go into a little more detail of what that means. So on the left side, I see all of my standard routes, because realistically, even though you build hundreds or thousands of different assemblies, you have some fairly standard routes that most assemblies go through your production, and you can define each of those routes. But depending on volume, depending on workload, depending on size of the job, you may adjust those routes. Maybe you've already got your main line in process for a more critical job, a new one's coming in, you can't run it on the standard route, you need to go through a different route that has different setup and run times, things like that. So you can have these alternate routes predefined and indicate which will be used or can be used for the assembly, and indicate which is the standard route or the default route for that given work order or that given assembly. Within the template for the route, you indicate for all the work centers that are used, the setup and runtime per work center, and the defect opportunities for that work center. You indicate where, if it's serialized, where serialization will begin in the process, and you can adjust those work center by work center as needed. And we're also introducing a new concept for optional work center processes. There's a few common approaches for how people will use this. One could be there's an assembly that goes through Work Center 1, Work Center 2, and then through a wash. And all day long, that's the process that it's going, 1, 2, wash, 1, 2, wash, 1, 2, wash. At the end of the shift, at the end of the day, the assemblies that have been through the first work center but haven't made it through the second work center but need to make it through the wash because they can't sit overnight, you can put an optional work center of a wash between the first and the second work center. By default, it's going to skip the wash work center because it's an optional work center, and automatically go to the second work center. But if you finish the shift and those boards have to go through the wash, you can put them in the wash, indicate that it's the optional work center after the first work center but before the second work center. That's when it was sent through the wash, so that the next morning when somebody comes in, they know, even though they're in the wash area, they need to go back to work center 2 to finish. Another way you might use this is to put an optional rework loop in context. So you have a few workstations throughout your routing where you need to do some rework. And if rework happens, you got to go through QA and touch up and then send it back to a different work center. So you would define the optional rework loop inside the routing. Again, by default, it's going to skip it. They're not going to transfer through it. But in the event that a defect is found at that inspection work center, they can kick it out to that optional rework loop, have them process it, and then put it back in the normal flow to continue the process. So it gives you a lot more flexibility and control without a lot of complexity in the setup and definition of the routing, and without having all of that visible and in your face in the production process. And because RMAs are processed different than standard jobs, you have the same setup capabilities to create a rework loop, so that if an RMA is generated for the assembly and a work order is created, the rework work order, it doesn't automatically default to a standard routing. It uses the rework routings and goes through a different process. Additionally, you can define your work instructions. You're indicating the template, the work center in your routing, and the document that should be provided to production to allow them to complete that production process. And this is a multi-page PDF document that is readily available. Similarly, you can define a work center checklist. Again, tied to the routing, tied to the work center, indicate the checklist items that should be completed so that in production they can see those and mark them off. You can also define the equipment. And these are any pieces of equipment that are needed in production in the selected work center. So you may have 10, 15 pieces of equipment in the work center, but for this particular routing, you're only going to send it through 2 or 3. So you indicate that here. And then you can load the relevant documents for the equipment. So if they need special operating instructions or whatever, that's all readily available to production through the control documents. And similar to that tooling and fixture setup, you can define all of the tooling and fixtures that are available, indicate which are required for the routings, for the assembly. You can even track the calibration date of that equipment so you know if it's within spec, and have all the related drawings that go with that. Now, once you have all this setup done and you're ready to do production, let's go to the other side and see how a production worker might interact with this information. So we'll go back into the PCM, Production Control Management, back into Wave Solder to see the jobs in my work center. And I'll go into my work order number 41 and click on Electronic Work Instructions. Right away, I'm presented with the quality information. So as the quality department is recording defects, this information is updated so that I can see real time what's going on with my job and the defects. I can see the tools and fixtures that are needed for this job. So again, I might have 15, 20, 50, whatever tools and fixtures set up, but this route for this assembly, these are the tools that were defined and the documents that are associated with it and the calibration dates so I know if they're still within spec. Similarly, I can see a list of the equipment that I use with any relevant documents for that, and have quick access to my work instructions. So I can pull it up, make sure that I'm building, see all of my pictures, make sure I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to do to get this production done. We've also implemented the note feature in here, so I can have conversations and communications related to work orders. This applies to all work centers for this work order. Work order work center notes are specific to this job and this work center. So maybe there's some device problem or something specific to this assembly that I have to be monitoring. I can have all those notes recorded here. And then work center notes apply to all jobs that are related to this specific work center. So if one of the machines is having issues, I probably want to put that in here so that production is aware of that as I have shift changes or day changes, things like that. And finally in here, the work center checklist. You can predefine the checklist items, and users can mark them off as they're completed to make sure that they are doing the required steps as it's moving through the process. Now, because this is all browser-based, it's easy to distribute and access from anywhere. You can do Chromebooks, tablets, any web-enabled device, pull up this document where they are as they need it, even set up Chromebook workstations as you want, and have it readily available so people can access it. And that covers the electronic work instructions. Do you have any questions related to that? Or questions related to anything that we've talked about today? Here's a question. Will the work order notes be notifications when they're created to the appropriate parties? So I believe the question is, when a note is added, will the users be alerted that the note has been created? The system does create notifications as you put notes on there. Okay. Can you deviate from the standard routing once the work orders have been issued? So similar to the old approach, the user's permissions will determine if they have full control so that somebody can transfer to a work center that isn't part of the standard flow. If they have full permissions, they can do that. If they don't have those full permissions, their only options are the next standard work center, required work center, or an optional work center that's in that loop, meaning it's been set up as an option after the current work center. Outside of that, they cannot deviate from this routing unless somebody goes in and updates the routing and pushes it to the job. Okay, if there aren't any questions, then we will call it a day. I appreciate everybody coming. Appreciate your participation, and we will talk to you again soon.